speaker, Dr. Chandra Muller. He is the Alma Madden Centennial Professor of Sociology at the University of Texas at Austin. Her research is centered on understanding how schools and education contribute to inequalities in later life with regards to work, health, and cognitive aging. She was awarded 50.3 million grants to study how education affects the development of Alzheimer's disease and related dementias from the National Institute of Aging. And she is currently leading two nationally representative longitudinal studies, which are the high school and beyond, and the National Longitudinal Study of the class of 1972. And these studies track individuals who were initially interviewed as high school students into their later years. In today's talk, she will discuss these projects with a specific focus on exploring how education influences cognitive aging. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Chandra Muller.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Stacy, for organizing everything and doing all the behind-the-scenes work, and Shannon's been all of you for coming. As Sarah mentioned, I'm going to talk about the studies that we're doing on education and cognitive aging. And really, I'm one of a bunch of people. The other PIs are listed here, but there is a very important group of people who are part of this, and we wouldn't be where we are without them. So it's important to recognize that this is very much team science. We are now an officially named project of projects, EdShare. EdShare refers to the two education cohorts that we're working on that work together. And I'll tell you more about them today. Here's a brief overview of what I'm going to talk to you about. I believe that studies, large studies, have to be understood in their historical context and in the meaning that they started with. We won't understand what we can do with them without understanding that historical context. So I'll give you a little bit of that. Then tell you about the first follow-up we ran, high school and beyond in midlife. Then about what we've recently done to extend it to study cognitive aging. I'll give some very, very, very preliminary results that I love to hear your thoughts on, and end up with some understanding of where we're going to go in the future, and would love to hear any input you have about that. So first, to get started, as part of many things that had to do with the expansion that happened after the war, the education studies came into their own during this time. There was the technology and computing power where we could actually collect and analyze larger data sets. One line of inquiry was around political polling, but another line of inquiry was around education, psychological testing, and so on. And that had multiple roots. The first was in the Cold War. That laid the groundwork for a data set, really the first large-scale national data set, Project Cowden. It was a large sample. I won't spend very much time on it. Over 400,000 9th through 12th graders. They are proud on their website to say that Janis Joplin was part of it. There are a couple other famous people. For those of you who know anything about research ethics, that would be deductive disclosure that is inappropriate, but it's on their website, so I encourage you to go have a look at their website. Many high schools, they actually collected data on about 5% of all students in the nation in public schools. The first wave was 1960, And then, they did 2 days of interviewing with a full day of cognitive testing. If any of you have adolescents, you can't even imagine that would happen today. And then 5 years later, they did a follow-up, kind of as an afterthought. They didn't collect contact information in the first wave, so the response rates for the second wave were pretty abysmal. They got worse over time, and they finally got around to collecting Social Security numbers, which is helpful when you want to find people. In 1971, and then they tried to do a recent follow-up, and they continued to follow up subgroups of that sample. Well, around that time, a whole other initiative was getting started. And it was more, I do want to say one more thing about Project Talent because it's important. The motivation here was that our workforce, our technology workforce, and in particular our armed forces, wasn't getting the top talent that we needed. And so the idea was to use those cognitive tests to figure out how to match people to the right jobs. Okay, so the real emphasis was on this cognitive testing. The psychologists were very involved in designing the study. Another initiative was happening around the same time domestically. It was very important. 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, separate is not equal. We needed to desegregate schools because the funding wasn't the same in these schools. 1964, the Civil Rights Act, that generated a whole bunch of stuff. I've got to look at my notes for some of this. With the Civil Rights Act came the next 3 things, 3 bullets. One was the Elementary and Secondary Education Act that targeted inequality and access to education with funding. So a lot of funding came and the entitlement programs came, both in terms of funding directly to schools, parental involvement promotion, textbooks, regional centers, extra help, library resources, strengthening state departments of education, and many more things. That was the that act. Also mandated were many other Great Society programs. At the time, the domestic programs, many of the domestic programs were under one cabinet secretary, Health, Education, and Welfare. And there was a great deal of interest in how to achieve the goals of the Civil Rights Act and do it efficiently and across these programs, the health, education, and welfare programs. So there were many other things that happened during this time. The third was something that I hadn't realized was so connected to the Civil Rights Act until I did a little of the historical analysis, and that was a rather transformative report for the called Equality of Educational Opportunity, otherwise known as the Coleman Report. And this ended up being pretty transformative for education work. Coleman and his team started in 1964. They went out and collected data from 4,000 students, 66,000 teachers, 600,000, 4,000 schools, teachers, and 600,000 students in those grades. In a year and a half, they produced the report. Just to give you a sense, we're taking 2 years of planning for our current data collection. Okay, they didn't have the computing power that we have now. It was pretty remarkable. It was a cross section. They weren't planning a longitudinal study at this point. And here were their key findings. Oh, I forgot to mention, The report was released on the 4th of July. Why? Congress hated it. So did the Department of Education. They found that the story was not in funding. It wasn't the differences in funding that explained the differences in learning and test scores. What it was the differences in what was happening in the schools. Well, this, needless to say, was not popular because all of the effort had been focused on equal funding, but it did catch the eye of people who were interested in designing studies for understanding how we could actually bring about better equality in education. In April of 1970, the Secretary of HEW, along with my personal hero, Dorothy Guilford, the NCES commissioner, and some other people, convened a group at the Mayflower Hotel. And they decided, they informed about Coleman report. They said, we need longitudinal data to understand how what happens in schools plays out over people's later education and the workforce. So that was the birth of the secondary longitudinal studies program. Little aside, Dorothy Guilford resigned 4 years later, saying, oh, I've got to get this quote exactly right. She said she resigned, she left NCES due to really nasty politics. Okay. But she left a legacy that has absolutely changed all of our lives. The secondary longitudinal studies was launched first, and then the first data collection was launched in that order. They decided they wanted a program first, and then they started the first longitudinal studies program. It was the NLS 72 and high school and beyond. I can't remember if I have any animation here. That's what I'm looking for. And you'll see that they were interviewed, people were interviewed over time. This shows years in school, but it could be their ages just as easily. Imagine ages, really it should be. This is from the Department of Education's website. Okay, and basically every decade since, the Department of Education has launched one of these SLSPs. And they're a fantastic resource. The first one, NLS 72, was 12th graders. In high schools, it focused on test scores. Then they gave half a day of cognitive testing and almost a full day of other questionnaires and so on. And did follow-ups the next year. And you can see when they did the follow-ups. The main findings were, guess what? What happens in schools, but focusing more on curriculum, seems to predict curriculum, test scores, and grades, but they found a lot that had to do with curriculum, seems to predict post-secondary outcomes and labor force outcomes. They also found, not surprisingly, that family resources shaped those outcomes. This is an interesting cohort. It's the middle of the baby boom. The men were still going to Vietnam. Half of the men, or about a third of the men, were subject to the draft lottery. The draft lottery was not used for the younger men in this cohort. This was the first cohort of women who had access to the pill and had aspirations beyond homemaker. So it's a very interesting cohort. I just want to add that in, I think it's the 1976 wave, NICHD gave the Department of Education money, and there's a whole module for those of you interested in family on relationships within the home and spouses and the reason for it was we were going to hell in a handbasket, and they wanted to get a handle on how divorce was coming about. So that was the motivation, but there are pages and pages of survey items about this. Okay. But it also clued us in that what's happening in schools is important, and 12th grade might be a little late to start to pay attention to it. Hence, the High School Beyond study, also designed by Jim Coleman with the help of a rather productive sampling statistician, who also designed, by the way, AbHealth, using some of the same models. This was a much more ambitious study, 2 cohorts, with a base year sample of almost 60,000 students in over 1,000 high schools, and sophomores and seniors. But very high compliance. People did what they were told back then. Good response rates still. Achievement test scores, achievement tests, and the kinds of questionnaire items that we've come to expect in these education studies. And they're comparable, by the way, across. There are some harmonized measures. Follow-ups were, as you can see, the sophomore cohort was followed up in 92. High school and post-secondary transcripts were collected. What were the key findings? One of the biggest findings was that social capital was something found in schools and could create human capital. In other words, it contributed to learning. Social capital, what's that? That's relationships among students and among students and their teachers. Trust, obligations, normative behavior, and so on. There's stuff that we sociologists study that can't be seen easily. Also, academic press. In other words, schools encourage students to do well academically in different ways, and those different ways matter. And also, different parts of the school might have different kinds of academic press. There are within school differences, and those within school differences have pretty big implications for people's lives. We're seeing a little preview that there are implications even in the data that we're collecting now. Okay, so what do I mean by this? Well, the High School Beyond, and to some extent, to a large extent, NLS 72 focused on these experiences and the context of schools, and then followed them through to to post-secondary work or study. We have educational credentials. These are some of the measures. I won't go into them too much more, but there are many. And it's a rich data set. These are the outcomes that were a focus, and they go way beyond educational attainment, and that's very important. Really, these education studies are the only ones now that have these kinds of measures available about what's happening to people in their schools as they're experiencing. I'm just going to give you a little bit of a lesson in what I mean by this as far as measures, because you need to know a little bit. The kinds of courses kids take impacts how they do in college and subsequently. This is just a way of organizing courses used by the U.S. Department of Education. Actually, it's part of the NAEP, the National Assessment for Educational Progress. The nation's report card looks at this. The rigorous and the mid-level courses are the ones that prepare kids for college. Standard prepares them somewhat for college, and below standard, they're really screwed. Okay, if they want to, unless they want to start doing remedial work in community college. You can see over here that in 1982, the vast majority of students were taking a below standard curriculum. By this later cohort, more and more students were taking a standard or mid-level or rigorous curriculum, but there are still a lot of students who aren't. So even today, you see the same thing. Many people aren't taking the kind of courses that they need to take just to function in the labor market, but I get ahead of myself here. Well, the easiest one of these courses to look at is the math course taking. It's something that's uniformly, available across schools. And so I'm going to concentrate a little bit on that. This is for the high school and beyond. Math by the end of high school. Remember that math is requires prerequisites to move forward. So it builds on sequential learning. Really, it's very difficult to skip up to a level and jump ahead. So it's a form of tracking. And in fact, we showed with the transcript data and ad health that it shapes the friendship networks that kids make. And it shapes what they do in their everyday lives. By the end of high school, the vast majority, well, almost 30% of kids have taken below algebra. Algebra is the cutoff where you learn abstract thinking. So before algebra, you haven't learned a lot of abstract thinking. The algebra 2 and above are contribute to that more rigorous coursework, okay, not automatically. Well, here's a graph of the students who haven't taken math, any math class at all in their senior year, so they could take more, but they didn't, or in their junior or senior year. Okay, so a lot of kids could take more rigorous courses than they are taking, and that's even true today. So why do we care? Well, the first midlife wave that we did was in 2014-15, and we focused on health and working longer. It's funded by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation and NSF that was interested in workforce issues. So we looked at some of these questions about health and workforce, and what did we find? We were, by the way, quite surprised. Everybody else who had been studying these kinds of questions had found it's really the actions in the test scores. If people have higher test scores, they're going to do okay throughout life. And if they don't, they're not. Well, that's not what we found. We found that it was the course taking that was the best predictor of many of these outcomes. This is just a graph of distributions for the lowest and the highest math course takers. Advanced math is algebra 2 and above, so they were ready for rigorous college and didn't take any advanced math. Okay, their self-reported health right before they were 50 years old was quite different for these two groups, you can see. Now, many of those people under the blue line who weren't doing as well could have taken more math. We actually estimated, and hi Paul, you're not going to like this next one, you might want to close your ears. We projected how the health might have changed if students had taken the math that they would have been positioned to take. Shannon, do you have a clarifying question? Oh, okay. So they had test scores, they had grades, they could have taken higher level math, and they didn't. They either didn't in their junior and senior year, or they didn't in their senior year. What we found, that's the original curve, what we found was there would have been about a 14% higher response in the more healthy category if the kids had taken more math. Now, of course, there are other variables that we don't know about, but it's just a simple analysis. Now, if they had gotten better education all along and been better positioned for advanced math, we might even see healthier people, who knows. We see a similar pattern with mortality rates and advanced math courses, and this surprised us as well. Much much clearer pattern for advanced math courses than for cognitive test scores or grades. Grades better, but less. Okay, so that's your risk of mortality by the last wave, which was by a little bit before age 50. And then one of graduate students wrote her dissertation on that, the labor force participation. She was especially interested in precarious employment. So she divided people up by sub-baccalaureate sector and the baccalaureate sector because there's more precarious employment in the sub-baccalaureate sector. And then she looked at the effects of the course taking on whether or not they had bad jobs. Bad jobs are defined by low wage work, part-time employment, no health insurance, and no retirement benefits. And you can see here that in both sectors, there are, and this is by men and women for obvious reasons, you divide by gender, by sex. So you can see that in all cases, though, those who have taken the more advanced math are in a better position regarding the workforce. And that's true. I was actually surprised at the findings, and there are some consistent findings for the sub-baccalaureate sector. I think it's because there was an emergence during this time. High school and beyond cohort graduated before the labor market really changed with respect to technology. But then in about 1990, 1992, the labor force changed where they really needed to understand more about technology. The bottom fell out. There was this U-shaped curve that the economists pay a lot of attention to, a lot of jobs that are bad and a lot of jobs that are good, and very little in the middle. The middle class was hollowing out. And one of the exceptions to that is in the middle, following out the sub-baccalaureate sector that is doing semi-skilled work and a lot of life science and health work. And so these people who are doing reasonably well, who took the math and science courses, chemistry also played a role, actually seem to benefit from them. Okay. So now, where are we? Well, we were interested in these results, and high school and beyond cohort was getting older. We researchers were not. We were staying the same age. And so they were now about to approach age 60. And we started to think, these results are unlike any that anybody else has been able to find. So we started talking to NIA about whether that they might be interested in funding a follow-up to study cognitive aging and health-related outcomes. They weren't, and they said they've already thought of action. They were aware of all those possible longitudinal studies. I've shown you the ages across the bottom here. So people were just under 50 in 2014, 15, 53. We followed the seniors in 2015, funded by NSF. Now people were approaching age 60 when health was really becoming an issue. Now, the thing about cognitive aging is that things start a whole lot earlier in the life course than is visible. So we have sort of ticking time bombs that we're living in terms of cognitive aging and the risk of dementia. And some of those have to do with cardiovascular disease and metabolic disease. Actually, quite a few of them have to do with preventable health conditions in one way or another, or stressors that cause these preventable health outcomes. Preventable in air quotes, but that's what we call catabolism. Another set of risks has to do role in our research questions. So we were interested in getting in on the ground level of these relationships before things had progressed too far. And so we were very interested in some of these health outcomes in particular. We did a big data collection. It was by telephone, web, and a few in paper. We had a 40-minute questionnaire where we covered more ground than we had in the past. We did neurocognitive assessments by real neuropsychologists who actually know about this, in contrast to somebody like me who pretends that I know the words and don't really fully understand, but they understand how these tests go with the brain and carefully designed the neurocognitive tests so that they would maximize the utility of this cohort. One of them also had the brilliant idea of collecting blood. So we collected blood from as many of the respondents as would sit still for us, collected saliva and physical measures from those people. And we've done a tremendous number of data linkages. So this ends up being a very rich data set. We are just looking at the very, very new data here. So just to warn you, there are more questions than answers, but I'm going to show you a few preliminary results from our very early work in a minute. First, I want to focus on this cognitive aging thing. And I've kind of glossed over, by the way, a major advantage of high school and beyond is that they have oversamples of certain underrepresented populations. And that ends up being very important to us. And in particular, there are oversamples of people, underrepresented populations who went through post-secondary education. So college-educated Black people, college-educated Hispanic people, an oversample of Cuban people. Okay, so this is not from our high school and beyond data. This is from, I think it's based on HRS, but no, it's based on a UK study. This shows when does cognition decline. It shows the curves. It's hard to read this, but these ages start at 20 and go up to 90 in each graph. And you can see that in word recall, the decline happens. The pattern is a little bit different than in verbal fluency. Number sequence is different still again, and so on and so forth. So the declines happen at slightly different ages, but it's not a good story for anybody who's aging, which is part of the reason that we don't age. Okay. Numeric problem solving stays around. One thing I want to mention here, because you see it across the tests, is many of these tests, you see an inflection point somewhere in the neighborhood of 70. Sometimes a little before, sometimes a little after. Here's one test, one memory score for men and women. They differ, but you can see the declines are quite similar. It's just, as we all know, women get higher test scores. Nothing new there. But what about education? Here are here's that same test for women and men by educational attainment. Less than high school or high school and less. I didn't go back to sort through that apparent anomaly in the graph. I don't know where the high school only fit. High school and some college is the middle, and then college. You can see up until pretty far along. The thing that differs for these groups is the intercept, not the rate of decline. So what we're seeing here is that people start out different when we start measuring them, but it's not until they become older that we begin to see changing rates of decline. And even so, the rates of decline are small compared to the differences in the intercepts. Well, This is what high school and beyond has right now. Just this little slice of age. Okay, so we need to get our bearings here. We're not going to be looking at change over time. We don't have data to do that. We only have data right now to look at these little slices. Here are our tests that we're very proud of from the telephone interviews. And these are weighted, and they are showing the curves by educational attainment. So what do we see here? Well, there's word recall and number span. Number span is going to be interesting. Number span, I think, has an element, probably the strongest element, I think, of executive functioning. I'll just put that little factoid on the table right now. The recall is really about verbal and memory, and then 2 verbal skills. We see that there are bigger differences in the curves for these fluency scores than for the other scores, but the curves are different, and particularly we're seeing high school and West as kind of coming out differently now. Okay, you can look at what about high school might explain the within or between differences in these curves. It does both. What happens in high school explains more of the differences between the curves and within each curve, within each educational group, but we get action on both. And just in general, there's between an 80 and 90% overlap in the area under these curves for across the educational group. So I'm going to show you results on some puzzles that I've been working on. I'll tell you up front, I have terrible solutions to them. I haven't figured them out yet at all. So I'll be very interested to hear what people think. This is my conceptual model that I've been working with others, Adam Brickman, in particular, the neuropsychologist who does brain work, and I have been working closely on this. We know that education, that there's a steep educational gradient in cognitive function over the life course, and including at age 60, and we saw some of that. Now, what we're interested in, though, are the biological pathways that might link education to the cognitive aging. And I'm not talking about genetic pathways. You might note that there is no hypothesized pathway here. I'll tell you why in a minute, but we don't expect education to affect all biology, or really the reverse. Okay, this is typically the set of measures. It's called the ATM framework, referred to as the ATM framework, that people who study dementia look at when they're trying to understand the precursors to dementia and what might be driving dementia. It reflects brain pathology, even though it can be measured in blood markers recently. It's possible to do that. It's better measured in MRIs and PET scans. And but much of the focus of the recent drugs to treat Alzheimer's is located here in this area. Okay, so that is a backdrop to what we're interested in, but we don't hypothesize that this has a whole lot to do with the social pathways and the educational pathways that contribute to dementia. One very interesting thing is that this relationship between the brain pathology and cognitive function is far from certain. People can have a lot of brain pathology and never show signs of dementia. And a set of hypotheses about why that might be true is related to education, in the sense that there's this hypothesis of cognitive reserve, that the brain is able to somehow adapt to the pathology that's happening in the brain, probably because mostly predisposition, bad genes, and to a lesser extent the neuropathology. The brain is able to adapt to those insults and find new networks to function. Okay, cognitive reserve. So we are interested in this, but not directly. We're interested in how education might influence that relationship between these two things. That's not front and center on mine because it's hard to model right now. But I'm going to show you the next set of our hypotheses that has more to do with what we think has to do with the social component. This is more systemic aging. Okay, it's what's happening in the body that may have implications for stuff that happens in the brain. It's mainly through the neurodegeneration. Somebody has a stroke, or if somebody has untreated high blood pressure, their brains are going to have lesions and other problems that can get in the way of cognitive functioning. So that's what we're interested in here. And so one set of questions is around what in education might make this pathway, in other words, make people at lower risk for the cardiovascular and metabolic problems. And then also, then the implications would be that they would have greater resilience to the cognitive decline. Okay. So I'm going to show you the findings that we could put together. On the left are 4 conditions that are well known to have bad effects on brain health. In the order that they are most prevalent in our sample: hypertension, diabetes, coronary heart disease, and stroke. Some of it's having bad genes. But then is it treated? Are you doing things? So that's why it's considered preventable. Okay. And on the right is just a sum of these. We can see, of course, that people, especially, nice typo there, especially people in some college group are reporting the most diagnoses with the health conditions, but it may be that the operative thing there is diagnosis. The people with lower levels of education may be less likely to be diagnosed. Emily has shown also that they're also more likely to not be around anymore. But then the other question is, well, how do they come together, right? And we can see a very clear gradient here. Yeah, you might have some bum luck with one or another bad predispositions, but when we see how they hang together, we see a pretty big education happening. That's one element of the story. The next is from the blood assays that we have. We haven't done all the assays yet, but we've done a few, and these are 2 that people who are in the know, that would not include me, would be most interested in seeing. The neurofilament light and the p-tau 181 are likely to be good indicators of some of that neurodegeneration that comes about both from the social conditions, but also from predisposition. And again, we measure this in the blood, but remember, these are people who are just before age 60, around age 60. And on the bottom is the quintiles for our cognitive scores. Okay, so we would expect that high high levels of the blood biomarkers are bad. And so people who have worse cognitive scores should have higher blood biomarkers, and people who have better cognitive scores should have lower blood biomarkers. You with me? Okay, we're not seeing that. However, we're not alone. Patterns and the distributions of our blood biomarkers were recently found in health and retirement study. And the guy who did the blood work for us does every single major study. And he said he's seeing the same pattern in all of these studies for age 60, for Alma age. So what does this mean? Remember, I said that this process is long and plays out over time. Probably cognitive decline, the risk factors for cognitive decline start 3 decades before that inflection point is 70, right? Heart disease and some of these health conditions and other stressors are starting much earlier. Should they necessarily show up in one place in the blood biomarkers? Maybe, maybe not. Nobody really knows. Nobody knows how these things play out. Almost certainly it's a very complex set of pathways that when you combine biology with how people manage their lives in social settings that vary a great deal, you're not going to have simple equations that show everything. And that's part of what we're seeing. And I'm giving myself a pep talk. I was like, so it's okay. The neuropsychologists thought that they were very interesting. Okay, so couldn't resist a little simple regression, predicting each of these test scores with the self-reported health conditions and the blood biomarkers. Guess what? We see the self-reported health conditions, and you know, these are just 1, 2, 3, 4, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. I know it should be done that. But it's not, it doesn't matter. You see similar results. They predict the test scores. And for the most part, we're not getting much, except in the neighborhood of that number span, which I do think has most to do with the executive functions. I think there may be something there. The expected negative relationship. Lo and behold, we have a positive relationship downstairs for these. And part of that's because we're controlling on the health conditions. So I don't totally trust this, but I think that the patterns are going to be complicated, and we really don't understand at this point. So how about our future? Well, going back to these studies, we are planning, well, we're in, right now, we're doing a major data collection for the NL72 study. I'll tell you about that in a second. And we're in the throes of planning our next follow-up for the high school and beyond, which we will be submitting for renewal stressfully in February. Okay. This shows the ages, which high school and beyond are these ages. If we go back, we'll go back when they're in their mid-60s. And these are the ages of the NLS 72. We will be going back to these people right at that inflection point that I mentioned, when the aging, the cognitive aging is starting to decline in a serious way. Just to put it in other terms so you can see relative to cognitive aging, this is the graph I showed you before. Here's where the NLS 72 will be hitting on that memory score. And if we go back to the high school and beyond again, it'll be right around there. But you'll see also that then we have some nice patterns of measures. So if we can get consistent measures across these cohorts, we'll be able to have some difference. What are we doing for the LS 72? Well, we got very ambitious and fooled people into thinking we had a good idea. So we get to do it. We're doing a 3-hour home interview, and that includes consents, and that includes a long interview. So our data collection contractor, every day that we talk to them, says that interview is really too long. And we know, but we really need, we're going back to them for this time. So we've got a full hour of cognitive, or we've got cognitive tests and physical measures, which we're collecting because these are very good indicators of what's happening through dementia. We're getting more items about some of their experiences and especially focusing on some of the things that we think may be creating stress. Now remember, this is the Vietnam cohort, the women's lib cohort, whatever you want to call it, right? And then we are collecting blood and saliva as we did before. And we are, for a very small subset, collecting a very expensive MRI component where we are actually going to be scanning their brains and archiving those scans. We've done a ton of record linkage that I love thinking about and talking about, and have geolocation where we're actually going, we've asked the contractor to collect every address and do the geolocation well, the best of our ability. Very exciting for us. First thoughts about high school and beyond follow-up for 2028, when they're in their mid to late 60s. These are very early thoughts for us. We want to focus on those biological pathways and use kind of the model that I showed you earlier. We also want to emphasize much more the social pathways, because this age, after most people have retired, is a time when social isolation can really come into play. So we're prioritizing the social pathways that may contribute to dementia. And then we're taking kind of a turn and saying, what are our profiles of healthy aging? And by that, we don't mean who just got lucky with their genes, but what does education have to do with bouncing back also from setbacks? So how do people end up coping and adapting and keeping their lives going? So that good things come in threes. We have 3 emphases, and I think we're kind of set on those. But beyond that, we can't possibly go back to everybody in our sample and do home visits. So we'll be doing a mixed mode and probably embed some methodological experiments. And that will be the new thing that our data contractors says they don't like, because we're going to make a shorter survey, but they hate the methodological experiments. Okay. And thank you. And I'd love to hear your input. I also would like to say that people are interested. There's so much work to do on this study, and I'd love to get your thoughts and your action, and please contact me if you're at all interested. So thank you. I know the drill. Students first. We can be quiet for one.
Amazing, so thank you so much. I know people have also worked on it. I'm very excited about it. I know these are preliminary, but I was wondering if you noticed any gender differences in the biological markers that you were showing versus the.
If I hadn't been giving this talk, I would be able to answer that question, because those results came in about 11 o'clock this morning. So I don't know. Yeah. Also, race and ethnic differences. A few of our team members are very eager to see that.
Thank you so much. Two questions for you. I thought that the increase in Cowden and rigor of textbook coursework between SB in 2009 was super interesting. You just sort of offhandedly mentioned that that had sort of flatlined or stopped. And so I wondered if you could talk about why. And then my second question was about data collection. So you mentioned that you linked people's surveys to all sorts of administrative records, and I wondered about permission for that. Do you have to ask individuals for permission for every single linkage?
Good question.
Yeah. How do you navigate that? Because that seemed like does everybody even know that they have real estate records that could be like seemed like a lot of complexity.
Yeah. Okay. The first question was about what's happened recently with the course taking. And to some extent, it has flatlined. There are more recent results. I didn't show them. I think that and actually the chair of the physical transport task force or something. I've seen those results, but I'm not sure if they're released. But there's still a big problem with people not taking courses that they've been taking. There are many, many reasons for it, but it does create a lot of inequity. So I'll just say that, on a campaign about that, and others are too. And actually, on our task force, we have principals and superintendents who spend all of their time trying to figure out ways to increase that. This is really permissions. This is a very hot button issue. So we do have permission for some of these linkages and not for others. And it is because, well, we have permission for everything. I should say we have consent for everything, but the form of the consent is different. Okay. For the pharma records, and in NLS 72, we'll be collecting lab and pharmaceutical records. We do have consents, and we have taken it. I think we had to get wet signatures, but maybe not. Maybe we can use DocuSign. We also have consent to store blood and collect blood, and we'll be collecting consents for the MRIs and so on and so forth. Basically, anything that's health related, almost anything is consent. Active consent at the point. Many of these other records fall under a law that gives permission to the U.S. Department of Education to link data. And remember, the initial purpose of the Secondary Longitudinal Studies program is to study how education shapes workforce outcomes, educational and workforce outcomes. So that anything that falls under that and the financial well-being of people typically does not require an active consent because it falls under the initial consent and the ongoing consents that people are given. So there are a few exceptions. Obviously, if we were to link to IRS records, which we're not going to, well, Treasury actually wants to work with us, but they want to do it. They don't want to give it us anything. Most things we have to be extremely careful with privacy. And it's not as if we don't go through bureaucratic hoops. We go through more bureaucratic hoops. I just am paying the bill to link the consumer credit records. I've spent 4.5 years navigating that. Okay. So yes, there are no active consents on that, but I paid in for it.
This really isn't a question, but I have a paper that I've written with some students that look at a parent's health on kids' likelihood of going to college, and we use AHA to look at their course taking. And basically, if you have a parent who self-reports poor health at wave 1, it not only means they don't go on to high school, but they're not taking, it affects their curricular choices. So
Yeah.
Part of the story is the intergenerational transmission.
Health disadvantage. That's right. Yeah. Right. Okay,
I guess I have two questions. One was, how many people in the sample have under, like what percentage that you all?
well, it's mostly the sophomores because the seniors have made it to senior year.
But the
yeah.
sophomores, did they graduate? Most of them graduated?
There's gosh, I can't remember the number exactly. There's not a huge number because they've made it to sophomore year, but there are enough that you can do an analysis of the group.
That's part of,
How, I wish I could, I don't know, you might know, but, or Coy, you might know, how many are in the, less than high school category approximately?
I can't remember the exact.
Yeah,
It's like
less than 1,000.
Less than 1,000.
Yeah.
part of the, you know, you want to consider is basically the difference in some of these effects, especially by quality of schooling or curriculum in this case, and its effect on biological aging or even cognition. At least for the HRS, what I'm finding with a full different data set is that their actual effects are much larger for people who don't graduate from high school.
Sure.
And it still has an effect later on, but it's I think it's larger than the point low coverage to
Right.
or
Right, I think that's right, that makes total sense. So if in effect, any effects that we find will be attenuated.
yeah.
Population.
The thing, right? And then when we think about, you know, minority populations,
Right.
right, there's going to be a disproportionate amount of minority populations who haven't graduated from high school. So I think when you're looking at some of those,
Well, I will advertise, however, that these data sets have an overrepresentation, over samples of people of color who are better educated. And that group is very important for understanding the health, long-term health, because we're seeing the data, but also they tend to be at higher risk for reasons that probably have to do with the social conditions. So if you're interested in that angle, this is your data set.
I'm a criminologist, so I saw criminal justice exposure and, you know.
Yeah.
You look like I was highlighted in red for me. Do you have any idea what that kind of assessment looked like? And
Yeah.
Is that
I have
any kind of
exactly an idea.
longitudinal, or is this kind of the first time of that information?
This is for the NLS 72, Sarah Brain actually put those items on for us. And I think we went back and forth with her. She, of course, didn't get what she wanted. Nobody ever gets what they want. Just go, you know, whoever can start doing the survey, you will not get what you want. But she did get what she needed, just like Mick Jagger always said. And so I think it mainly came from something like NLS Y or something, and you know, the bigger surveys. We don't have good arrest records, and very, you know, we have spotty accounting. Now, the high school and beyond cohort actually was a cohort that was subject to a lot of incarceration because of their age and you know, war and like the jail people for doing stuff. And so we are planning to prioritize collecting some of that information next week for high school and beyond. And every time I go visit my friends at the Department of Education, I say, hey, you guys want to link to the criminal justice records? And they go, which ones? And then we go down a rabbit hole because there's no good central.
Well, have
database.
you looked at Michigan, the CJARS administrative data set that's coming together?
If you send it to me, I'll have a look. I mean, it's, yeah.
We can talk about this later, but there have been a number of studies which have been frustrating about these pathways. So, you know, it's like education is related to cognition, dementia, but when you control for the diseases, the education effects don't change. Like zero. Still, and you put in information, and all the biological variables are indeed related, but they somehow, this kind of pathway idea is a lot more complicated. And I think you're getting at this issue is that we don't have a sense. And I think that that's the one thing that we, as social scientists, we tend to think in terms of pathways. the results are forcing us into thinking about exposures in a different way as opposed to pathways themselves. So just
Yeah, no, I think that's a point well taken. So probably the word pathways isn't quite right.
But I
But
think it's,
I don't know
but
what
it's
the
one that we
alternative
use
is.
all the time,
Right,
you know?
right.
And the only other thing I'm gonna say is, those education effects were really interesting that you had in terms of like the cumulative. And I go back to when I was a baby in statistics and thinking about multi-normally distributed variables around everything else, except that you have no variation in the high education group. And we're finding a lot in terms of the work that we do, that the high education group, they look so homogeneous. I mean, in terms of like their health profiles, their cognition, everything relative to the other groups. And so that kind of within group variation may have some potential to think about as you move through how all these things are related, because we almost never look at
The highly educated.
well, also like within group variation and where signals can come from in the like where disease signals can come from within the education distribution. So it's just
I mean,
conundrums.
I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you think, because, you know, the health researchers tend not to think about within educational group variability, and we've been fighting against the current a little bit on that thing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.